The chamber had 47 seats and 0 windows. This was done on purpose. Windows gave species something to look at when they did not want to look at each other. The Galactic Council had learned, over 600 years of operation, that eye contact, or the nearest equivalent, was the tool that closed deals. So the walls were blank. The light was even. There was nowhere else to look. Councillor Terran took his seat at the curved table and set his files flat in front of him. He had read them already, 3 times. This was unusual. Most councillors read their files once, the night before, and trusted the procedure to carry them through the rest. The procedure always did. It had never failed in 23 consecutive applications. Today was application 24. The species gathered in the chamber were the usual mix: tall, short, gaseous, solid, photosensitive, sound-dependent, a few that technically shouldn't have been in the same atmospheric conditions, but had signed the necessary waivers. They talked among themselves in the low, careless way of people who were not expecting anything interesting to happen. Some were already composing messages back to their home offices. One delegate from the Oran Collective had brought a meal. Terran watched them and said nothing. His species communicated partly through color, a shift in the bioluminescent layer beneath their outer skin. His baseline was blue, had been blue for 40 years of active service. Blue meant he was certain. Blue meant he had the shape of the room figured out, and was simply waiting for events to confirm his read. Blue was the color of a man who had done this before and knew exactly how it would go. He was blue now. He was also, underneath the blue, something he had not been in a long time: uneasy. The session was called to order. The procedural officer, a rotating position today occupied by a delegate from the Moor sovereignty, read the formal language that opened every demand session. The words were old. They had the weight of repetition behind them, the kind of weight that comes not from meaning, but from the number of times a thing has been said and followed by compliance. 600 years of compliance. It made the words feel like gravity. The demand of collective correction was transmitted. A full document. 42 pages of formal council language, translated in real time into Terran standard by the Chamber's translation architecture. It covered everything the Council required of the Terran Empire. Full military disarmament within 15 standard cycles. Dissolution of all expansion zones beyond their original home system cluster. And integration into the Council structure as a protectorate species. A status that came with protections, resources, representation, and the permanent and non-negotiable condition that they would never again operate independently in any matter of galactic significance. It was, by any measure, the end of the Terran Empire as a sovereign entity. 23 prior species had received a version of this document. Every one of them had either complied or been corrected. Those that had been corrected no longer existed as unified civilizations. They existed as administrative zones now, stable and quiet, their populations distributed into the broader fabric of council governance. It was not cruel. The Council had made sure to frame it as not cruel. Life quality metrics were maintained or improved. They simply were not themselves anymore. The Terran ambassador received the document on her desk display. She was a younger woman, younger than Terran had expected, though he knew age read differently across species. She had the kind of face that gave nothing away, not because it was trained to hide things, but because it had simply decided, a long time ago, that open reaction was a luxury worth dropping. She read the document. She did not skim it. She read it, page by page, and the chamber waited, and the low background conversation died off, one thread at a time, until the room was completely still. She finished, set the display flat on the desk, looked up, said, "We'll need 30 days. The room sat with that for a moment. Not "we reject this," not "we accept," not "we need to consult our government, our council, our military command structure, our people." not the 18 standard procedural responses that the Council's own guidelines laid out for receiving species to choose from. 30 days. The procedural officer asked, with a politeness that had calcified into reflex, whether the Terran ambassador wished to make any statement regarding the content of the demand. No, she said. 30 days. The room interpreted this as a request for time to organize compliance logistics. It was the most generous reading available, and it was the reading most of the chamber chose because it was comfortable and because the procedure said this was how it went. A species needed time to communicate the decision back home, to prepare their populations, to organize the administrative handover. 30 days was reasonable. The chamber began to empty in the usual way. Small clusters of delegates reconnecting with their home offices, the brief negotiations of schedule and protocol that followed every formal session, the background machinery of a 600-year institution moving forward on its rails. Vetheran did not move. He sat at the curved table after the others had left and looked at the door the Terran ambassador had walked through. She had not looked back, had not paused, had picked up her display and left with the specific confidence of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has already decided how they will arrive. He pulled up his files again, not the demand document, the Terran archive. The background research his office had compiled over the past 2 years as the Council's attention had turned toward the Empire's expansion. It was a large archive. Most of his staff had focused on the military index, fleet numbers, weapon classifications, territorial mapping, the standard threat assessment framework that the Council had used for 600 years to determine how much force a demand needed behind it. Vetheran had read the military index. It was significant. He had noted it and moved past it. He had been reading the history, not the military history, the other kind, the internal kind, the things that had happened on one planet before humanity had left it. The collapses, the rebuilds, the diseases they had given themselves and survived, the wars they had fought against each other at scales that made most interspecies conflicts look like disputes over a fence line. The thing that kept pulling at him was not the scale. It was what came after the scale. What they built, then what they lost, then what they built again, different, larger, from the rubble of the last thing, on a single planet, before they had anywhere else to go. He sat in the empty chamber and read, and his color, that steady professional blue, the blue of 40 years of certainty, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough that if anyone had been in the room to see it, they would have asked him what was wrong. No one was in the room. He kept reading. Outside, in the station's main corridor, the Terran ambassador walked to the transit platform without looking back. Her aide, falling into step beside her, asked how it had gone. "Fine," she said. "Did you say anything?" "A little." "What did they—" "30 days," she said. "We have 30 days. Her aide nodded, processing. "That's not much time." She looked at him sideways, not unkind, the look of someone deciding how much to explain and landing on, not much. Day 1 passed. Then Day 5. Then 10. The Council watched the Terran Empire the way you watch a pot of water when you have been told it will boil. Nothing happened. The water sat there, flat and still, and refused to perform. No emergency broadcasts from the Terran home systems. No fleet movement along the expansion zone borders. No public statements from the Imperial government. No diplomatic outreach to any of the 47 Council member species. Not even the ones the Terrans had prior trade agreements with, the soft relationships that collapsing civilizations always pulled on first, reaching for allies, reaching for anyone who might soften the landing. The Terran Empire did nothing. In the beginning, the Council read this as expected. Processing time, administrative quiet, while the Imperial government prepared its population for the terms. It was uncomfortable news to deliver to your own people, that the civilization you belonged to was about to change shape permanently. You needed days to build the right language around it. You needed to frame it carefully. Compliance with a demand of collective correction had, in the 3 cases where the Council had tracked it closely, always been preceded by a period of internal silence. The species turned inward. They had the hard conversation at home before they had it with anyone else. By day 15, the easy reading was becoming harder to hold. An internal session was called. No Terrans present. Council procedure kept species out of deliberative sessions until the response window closed. The 47 delegates gathered in the chamber with its blank walls and even light and no windows. The mood was still mostly calm. The Oran delegate, who had brought a meal to the last session, brought a larger one to this one. The Moor Sovereignty's procedural officer had already drafted the administrative framework for Terran Protectorate integration, a document that assumed compliance, because that was the only outcome the procedure made room for. Vetheran sat at the table and did not look at the draft. He had not slept well. This was a biological fact and not a metaphor. His species needed a specific type of low-frequency sound environment to achieve proper rest, and the sound environment he required was currently being disrupted by his own thoughts, which kept returning to the same pages of the Terran archive with the persistence of a tongue finding a sore tooth. He waited until the general mood-sharing portion of the session was done. Then he raised his hand. Has anyone read past the military index in the Terran archive? The room considered this. 47 species. Between them, staff teams numbering in the thousands. Every one of those staff teams had received access to the full Terran archive as standard pre-demand research protocol. The silence lasted longer than Vetheran expected. He was not the only one who had noticed something. He could see it in the way 2 other delegates shifted. The specific stillness of people who had looked at something they weren't sure how to name. But neither of them spoke. Perhaps because naming it would require them to take a position, and the procedure did not currently ask for a position. The procedure asked for patience. The 30 days were not yet up. I would like to request that the response window be extended, Vetheran said. The procedural officer asked on what grounds. He almost said, I am afraid, which would also have been a professional catastrophe. A counselor of his tenure admitting personal discomfort as procedural grounds for adjusting a 600-year framework. He said instead, incomplete assessment. The request was denied. Procedurally unnecessary. The window was 30 days. The Terrans had agreed to 30 days, and the Council had no standing mechanism for extension without cause that met the formal threshold. He did not push further. That was also a choice. He went back to the archive. The military index was, as his staff had assessed, significant. The Terran Empire maintained a defensive fleet of a scale that would make any direct correction expensive. Not impossible, but expensive in the way that forced a recalculation. That was standard. Several prior demand recipients had maintained significant military capacity. It had never ultimately mattered, because military capacity answered the question of force, and force was not the Council's first tool. The first tool was the demand itself, the paper, the document, the weight of 600 years of compliance pressing down on the receiving civilization's leadership until compliance felt like the only shape the future had room for. Force was the second tool. No one had needed the second tool in 112 years. Vetheran was not worried about the fleet numbers. He was reading about floods. Specifically, a flood that had occurred on humanity's home continent. The largest one. The one they had built most of their early civilization on. Approximately 9,000 years before they achieved space travel. The flood had destroyed 3 of their 7 dominant civilizations at the time. Millions dead. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, architecture, agricultural infrastructure, washed away in weeks. What happened next was the part he kept returning to. They rebuilt. Not in the same place. The floodplains were gone, the soil reshaped, the old geography erased. They moved, built new cities on higher ground, developed new farming techniques shaped by what the flood had taught them. Within 200 years, the civilizations that had survived the flood were larger and more advanced than the ones that had been destroyed. Not because they were special, because they were used to starting over. Vetheran read that section 4 times. He read the margin notes his junior staff member had added, which said, "Historical resilience pattern, noted for context, not operationally relevant." He looked at those words for a long time. He disagreed with them in a way he could not yet articulate. On day 29, a single vessel appeared on the station's approach scanner. Terran registration. Small. Courier class. No weapon signature. 1 passenger, according to the manifest transmission it sent ahead of docking. The station's intake officer processed the manifest in the standard way, flagged the Terran registration for council notification, as per the active demand protocol, and forwarded the passenger information to Vetheran's office as the session's lead counselor. His aide brought him the manifest. He looked at it. The passenger carried no military title, no diplomatic classification under any of the 47 council member species standard frameworks. The title listed was not one Vetheran had encountered in a receiving species representative before. Archivist General, Terran Imperial Memory. He looked at the words. The Terrans had 30 days to respond to a demand that had ended 23 civilizations' independence. They had sent a librarian. His color shifted. Not dramatically. Not the sharp change that would have alarmed his staff if they had been watching. A slow movement, like a room losing light as a cloud covers the sun. Gradual enough that you don't register the moment it happened, only that the room is darker than it was. His aide asked if everything was all right. Schedule a formal reception for the Terran representative, Vetheran said. Full council session, tomorrow morning. His aide confirmed and left. Vetheran looked at the manifest again. Archivist General. He had been afraid before. A quiet, professional fear. The kind he had kept folded neatly in his chest, where it couldn't affect his work. Now it was something different. Not larger exactly, just cleaner. The kind of fear that arrives when you have been guessing at the shape of a thing in the dark, and someone finally turns on a light, and you see you were right. He closed the manifest. He did not sleep that night either. He was old. This was the first thing the chamber noticed about him, and the thing they could not stop noticing afterward. Not old in the way that some species aged, a gradual withdrawal of vitality, a dimming. Old in a different way. Old like something that had been shaped by a very long process, worn smooth by it, the roughness taken off by time the way a river takes the roughness off a stone. Nothing wasted in his face. Every line there because something had put it there. He carried a data core under one arm. The casing was unusual. Vetheran recognized the material from his archive research, an alloy that the Terran Manufacturing Index listed as no longer in production. The mines that had produced it had been exhausted 2 centuries ago. The material had not been replaceable, so when things made from it wore out, they were gone. This casing had not worn out. Someone had kept it. The Archivist General of the Terran Imperial Memory sat down at the table without waiting to be directed to a seat. He chose the chair directly across from the procedural officer, the geographic center of the table, the position that put him equidistant from every delegate in the room. He set the data core in front of him, folded his hands over it. Then he waited. The procedural officer, slightly wrong-footed by the seating choice, recovered and opened the session with the standard formal language. He asked the Terran representative to identify himself and state the nature of his presence before the council. "My name is not important," the old man said. "My title is Archivist General. My presence is the Terran Empire's response to your demand. The procedural officer noted that a response to the demand was expected to take the form of one of 18 standard procedural options as outlined in the Council's Receiving Species Guidelines. The old man looked at him. "I'm going to tell you some history," he said. "That's the response." The room moved. Not physically. Most delegates stayed perfectly still. But the atmospheric pressure of 47 species, simultaneously recalibrating, changed something in the air. The Oran delegate, who communicated through low-frequency vibration, emitted a tone that his neighbor's translation unit rendered, somewhat helplessly, as, "That does not go in this box." Vetharan did not move at all. The old man opened the data core. He began with the first collapse. Not the Terran Empire. This was thousands of years before any Terran Empire. This was the earliest civilization they had built on their first continent. The one that had fed itself on the floodplains and organized itself around a river so large that its annual flooding was the rhythm the whole society lived by. He described how it collapsed, not attacked, not destroyed from outside. It ran out of topsoil. It had farmed the same land for so long, without understanding what it was taking from the ground, that the land simply stopped producing. The civilization starved. Over 2 centuries, it wound down and went quiet. He described it without emotion, as a fact, as a thing that happened. Then he described what the people who survived it built next. He moved through centuries. The chamber listened. Some delegates had brought translation support staff who were struggling, not with the language, which was clean and simple, but with the framing. There was no accusation in it. The old man described catastrophes and survivals with the same exact tone, the same measured pace. And this was somehow more difficult to listen to than drama would have been. Drama could be categorized. Drama was a performance, and performances ended. This felt like something else. This felt like testimony. The wars came 3 hours in. The room had thought it understood the Terran military history. The fleet index, the weapon classifications, the territorial maps. They had all read those files. The numbers were large, but numbers could be contextualized. Numbers had neighbors. You put them next to your own numbers, and you found the ratio, and the ratio told you what to feel. The old man did not give them numbers. He described what the wars felt like from inside. Not from a military command perspective, from the ground. He described a conflict that had lasted 31 years on their home continent, in which the weapons used were not energy-based or biologically engineered, but purely mechanical. Projectiles, explosive charges, things that required no advanced technology to produce, and were therefore impossible to run out of. He described what that meant for the people who lived in the path of those weapons, plainly, without looking away. He described the treaties that ended that war. He described the 23 years of relative peace that followed. He described the next war, which was larger. The delegate from the Yisan Communion had gone completely still an hour ago. The Yisan experienced time non-linearly. They described it in their own language, as existing in several moments simultaneously, though the translation always suffered. One of Vetharan's staff had whispered, with careful and nervous humor, that the Yisan delegate might be looking forward, trying to see what came after the history being described. If she was, her face gave nothing useful away. At hour 5, the old man reached the period immediately before Terran space travel. Vetharan had read this section of the archive more than any other. The century that preceded their expansion, the resource crisis, the atmospheric damage they had done to their own planet over centuries of industrial development, the extinction of a significant portion of their coexisting species, the population pressures, the wars that rose from those pressures. The old man described all of it. Then he said, "We fixed it. Not we conquered the crisis, not we rose above our challenges." He said fixed, a small plain word, a word for what you did with a broken door or a leaking pipe. You fixed it. You assessed the problem. You applied the solution. You moved on. It took about 200 years, he said. We rebuilt the lost ecosystems where we could. We stopped the wars, not because we became peaceful people, but because we agreed that the planet couldn't carry any more of that, and we were not yet ready to do it somewhere else. He let that sit. Vetheron felt the room feel that last sentence. Not yet ready. Past tense. Yet. As in, later they were. The old man reached hour 6. He closed the data core. He looked around the table. 47 species. Some afraid, in whatever way their biology expressed it. Some calculating. Some like the Oran delegate, who had brought a meal and not touched it for 4 hours. Simply very still. We wanted you to know who you were asking, he said. That was it. No counter-demand. No threat delivered with the language of threat. No fleet numbers, no weapon yield statistics, no territorial warnings. He did not say, and therefore you should be afraid. He did not say, and therefore we refuse. He did not say, and therefore anything. He folded his hands over the old data core and waited to be dismissed. The procedural officer asked, after a silence that lasted longer than any silence in a formal council session in living memory, whether the Archivist General wished to add anything further to the response. No, the old man said. He had said what he came to say. He waited. And Vetheron, sitting at the curved table in the windowless room, looked at the old man's hands resting on a data core made from material that no longer existed, and understood, with the cold, clean clarity of a thing that had been true for a long time, and had finally arrived where he could see it, that the Terran Empire had not sent a response. They had sent a mirror, and the Council was looking at itself in it. The old man was escorted to a waiting room. He did not complain about it. He sat down in the chair nearest the door, pulled something from his coat pocket, a flat handheld device, the kind used for personal reading, and opened it. He found his page. He read. The escort officer, who had expected to manage a difficult guest, stood outside the door for a moment, feeling slightly unnecessary. In the main chamber, the session had closed and immediately reopened as an emergency deliberative. Internal, no receiving species present. The formal designation that meant what was said in this room stayed in this room. The procedural officer had called it. 3 delegates had seconded before the call was finished. The room had refilled in the time it took most of the 47 delegates to walk from the corridor back to their seats. The atmosphere was unlike any council session Vetheron had sat in for 40 years. He knew what panic looked like in a mixed-species chamber, the competing biological responses layered over each other, the translation units struggling to keep up with everyone talking at once. This was not that. This was something quieter, and in its quietness, worse. This was 47 species sitting in their seats and thinking very hard. The Oran delegate had still not touched his meal. The Yesin delegate had not moved in over an hour, which for a species that normally required minor physical repositioning every 12 minutes was the Yesin equivalent of screaming. The representative of the Moor sovereignty, the one who had drafted the administrative framework for Terran protectorate integration, a 30-page document that assumed compliance, had the document open on his display and was staring at the first page. Just the first page. He had not scrolled. The procedural officer opened the floor. For a moment, no one spoke. Then 4 delegates spoke at once, and the translation architecture sorted them into sequence. And the first formal contribution to the session came from the youngest delegate in the room, the Drethian representative, a species that had joined the council only 40 years ago, and therefore had not been present for a demand session before. She said very carefully, I want to make sure I understand the procedure correctly. The demand has been issued. The receiving species has responded. What is the current status? The procedural officer confirmed. The demand was still active. The Terran response had not been a formal acceptance or rejection of any of the 18 standard procedural options. It did not fit within existing response classifications. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means," the procedural officer said, "that we proceed to the correction phase, or we withdraw the demand." The room heard that. Vetharan watched it land differently in different delegates. Some of them were already moving toward the correction phase in their thinking. He could see it in their body language, the small straightening of posture that came with deciding. The demand had been issued. The procedure said there were only two outcomes. The Terrans had not complied. Therefore, correction. It was clean, it was simple, it was what the framework was built to produce. He let them settle into that position. Then he stood. He did not do it dramatically. He simply stood, and because Vetharan had not stood to address a session in 4 years, he submitted written positions, he communicated through staff. He was not a floor speaker. One by one, the smaller conversations stopped. "I would like to speak," he said. The floor was given. He did not look at his notes. He had not written any. "The demand of collective correction works," he said. "It has worked for 600 years. I want to be clear that I understand why, because what I am about to say is not an argument that it has been wrong. It works because it operates on a specific mechanism. That mechanism is the survival calculation." He let that land before he continued. "Every species, when presented with the genuine possibility of collective destruction, makes a calculation. The calculation is, what is survival worth? The answer for every species we have ever encountered has always been, everything. Everything is worth survival. Whatever must be given up to continue existing. Sovereignty, independence, self-determination, these things are painful to lose, but they are not survival itself. The demand succeeds because it presents a clear and credible threat of non-survival. And every species in the galaxy has the same response to that threat." He paused. "I have been reading the Terran archive for 30 days, he said. "I want to share one thing I found." He did not use a display. He spoke from memory. There is a period in Terran history, approximately 1100 years before their space travel, in which 3 separate civilizations on their home planet developed, independently of each other, a specific type of weapon. This weapon, when used on a sufficient scale, was capable of destroying not just the target civilization, but the atmospheric and agricultural conditions that all civilizations on the planet depended on. It was a weapon that, if used to its full capacity, would have killed everyone. The room understood this. Most advanced civilizations had passed through this period. The development of species extinction-level weaponry was a recognized stage in technological development. All 3 civilizations used these weapons, Vetharan said. The room was absolutely still. Not to full capacity, but they used them, and afterward, after the damage, after the deaths, after the parts of the planet that would not recover for centuries, they did not lose the weapons. They kept them. They built more. Different kinds. They continued to develop extinction-level capability for the next 400 years, right up to the moment they achieved space travel, at which point they stopped building them. He let the room sit with that. Not because they were forced to stop, not because an outside force intervened, because they decided that the planet had been through enough. They made a choice. The silence stretched. "The demand works," he said again, "because every species in the galaxy has the same response to the threat of non-survival. But the Terrans are not responding from within that framework. The framework assumes that a species will prioritize survival above all things. The Terrans have, in their own history, encountered the genuine possibility of their own extinction. Not from an outside threat, but from themselves. And their response was not to surrender the thing that was threatening them. Their response was to master it, and then to choose, voluntarily, when to stop." He looked around the room. "You cannot threaten a species that has already made peace with the cost of its own destruction. The demand has no mechanism for this. The survival calculation does not apply. We are not offering them survival. We are offering them continued existence under our governance. And they already know, from 10,000 years of their own history, that continued existence is not the same thing as worth continuing. The room heard it. Some of them had heard it already. In the 6 hours the old man had spoken, and had been trying to find a different shape for it. Veth Aran had just named the shape. The Drethian delegate, quietly. Then what do we do? The vote was called. Proceed to correction or withdraw the demand. Species voted in the order their names appeared on the session roster, alphabetical by their council designation. It took 40 minutes. Some delegates voted without hesitation. Some paused. The Moor representative closed the integration framework document before he voted. Just closed it and set the display face down on the table. The count came in. Veth Aran was the last name on the roster. The count was 44-2 in favor of withdrawal. His vote would not change the outcome. The procedural officer called his name. He submitted a notation before his vote. The notation requested the Council's procedural committee to recognize a new diplomatic classification, one that didn't currently exist in the 600-year-old framework. Not protectorate, not standard independent species, something that had no name yet. Sovereign peer, an equal, not under the Council's governance, not outside it, alongside it. The kind of relationship that assumed the other party had the right to refuse you, and you had the right to refuse them. And neither refusal ended the relationship. The notation caused 12 minutes of confusion. Procedurally, it shouldn't have been possible to submit a classification request mid-vote. The procedural officer said so. 3 delegates agreed with the procedural officer. 2 delegates argued the notation was valid under the emergency deliberative rules. The argument lasted longer than the vote. In the end, the notation was accepted. Veth Aran voted. The demand was withdrawn. He sat down. The room began to move, the release of held pressure. Delegates reaching for their devices, the quiet, practical machinery of an institution adjusting its direction. He sat still for a moment. He thought about the old man in the waiting room, reading his book, one hand resting on a data core made from something that no longer existed. He thought about what it meant to carry something that carefully for that long. He stood up, straightened his jacket. The waiting room was small. It had a chair, a low table, a water dispenser stocked with 3 varieties suited to common galactic physiologies, and a wall panel that displayed the station's transit schedule in rotating languages. The light was standard grade. The ventilation hummed at a frequency calibrated to no species in particular. The Archivist General had found a position in the chair that seemed to suit him. His legs were crossed at the ankle. The data core was on the table beside him. The handheld device was in his hands, open to a page he had been reading for the past hour and a half. And when Veth Aran opened the door, he did not look up immediately. He finished the sentence he was on. Then he looked up. He did not look like a man who had been waiting a long time. He looked like a man who had sat down recently and expected to sit for a while longer. The specific patience of someone who had decided before the wait began that the waiting was fine. Veth Aran stepped into the room. He left the door open behind him. The escort officer, who had been standing in the corridor, took one look at Veth Aran's face and found somewhere else to be. The 2 of them were alone. The demand has been withdrawn, Veth Aran said. The Galactic Council has recognized the Terran Empire as a sovereign peer. The classification is new. We are still writing the formal language for it. The old man nodded once. It was not the nod of surprise. It was the nod of someone confirming something that matched their expectations. A small, clean movement, nothing extra in it. He closed his book, marked his page first, then closed it. He reached for the data core, set it in his lap. His hands rested on the old casing, that irreplaceable alloy, the material the minds had run out of 2 centuries ago, with the ease of long familiarity. Like setting your hands on the arms of a chair you had sat in for many years, not thinking about it. Just home. "Was this your recommendation, counselor?" he asked. The question was direct, quiet, not a challenge, genuine. Terran had been asked many things in 40 years of council service. He had answered most of them through the proper channels: written positions, formal statements, procedural filings. The architecture of institutional language, which existed partly to communicate information, and partly to keep the person communicating it at a professional distance from the thing they were communicating. He answered this one without that distance. "Yes," he said. The old man looked at him, not measuring, not performing any calculation that Terran can see. The particular attention of someone who is actually listening rather than waiting for their turn. "Why?" he asked. Terran had thought about what he would say if this question was asked. He had thought about it in the 40 minutes of the vote, and in the 12 minutes of procedural argument over his notation, and in the walk from the main chamber to this small room. He had considered the formal version, the analysis, the historical pattern assessment, the strategic conclusion that a demand outcome against the Terran Empire carried costs that exceeded the benefits of the demand's success. It was all true. It was all documented. He could have said it in clean, professional language, and it would have been accurate. He said something else. "Because you waited 30 days, he said. "You did not mobilize your fleet. You did not issue a counterstatement. You did not contact any of our member species privately to build a coalition against us. You sent your ambassador to receive the demand, and she read it, and she asked for 30 days, and that was all." He stopped, then continued. "And then you sent one person, not a general, not a diplomat with a counteroffer, an archivist with a data core. And he sat in front of 47 species and told us your history for 6 hours. And at the end of 6 hours, he said we should know who we were asking. And he waited to be dismissed." The waiting room hummed. "The most frightening moment of my career," Terran said, "was sitting in that chamber trying to understand what that meant. What kind of civilization does that? What kind of civilization receives a demand that has ended 23 independent species and responds by sending a teacher?" The old man was quiet for a moment. "Did you figure it out?" he asked. "What it meant?" "I think so," Terran said, "but I wanted to hear it from you." The old man looked down at the data core in his lap. His thumb moved along the edge of the casing, a small unconscious movement, the kind your hand makes when you are thinking and your hands need something to do. "It means," he said, "that we have done this before." He said it simply, the way he had said everything else in the 6 hours before. No performance in it, no weight added to make it land harder. The weight was already in it. He didn't need to add anything. "Not this exactly," he said. "We have never been summoned before a galactic council. But the shape of it, something larger telling us to become smaller. Something that had more apparent power, telling us to accept that our situation was now changed and permanent." He paused. "We have had that conversation with ourselves, many times. The words were different, the room was different, but the question was the same, and we know what we did when we were asked it." Terran did not ask what they did. He had spent 30 nights reading the answer. "The archive," he said. "The archive," the old man agreed. Silence. Not uncomfortable. The specific silence of 2 people who have said the most important things and are now simply in the same room with them. Terran looked at the data core, the irreplaceable casing, the alloy that no longer existed. "How old is that?" he asked. The old man looked down at it. "The case? 180 years. And the data? Older." He ran his thumb along the edge again. "The oldest entry is about 9,000 years. A flood. One of the first things we thought was worth writing down." Vetheran thought about that. A civilization that had decided, 9,000 years ago, that a flood was worth recording. That the record of what they had lost, and what they had built after, was worth keeping. Keeping so carefully that it survived industrial collapses, and resource crises, and 31-year wars, fought with weapons that never ran out, and the atmospheric near-death of their own planet, and 2 centuries of space expansion, and then a journey to a galactic council station in a small courier vessel. Someone had always kept this. The old man stood. He was not tall. He was the height of a man who had always been that height, and had stopped thinking about it. He tucked the data core under his arm, the easy, practiced movement of 1,000 previous tuckings, and he looked at Vetheran. "Thank you, counselor," he said. "Not for the decision, not specifically. Just thank you," the plain version. Vetheran nodded. The old man walked to the door. He moved without hurry, the movement of a person who had somewhere to be and was confident of arriving. At the door he stopped, not dramatically. He had remembered something. "The classification," he said. "Sovereign Peer. That was your idea?" "Yes, that's a good name for it." He left. Vetheran stood in the small waiting room and listened to the footsteps until they were gone. The ventilation hummed, the transit schedule rotated on the wall panel, languages cycling, arrival times updating, the ordinary business of a station that did not know what had happened in its conference rooms today, and would not stop functioning to find out. He stayed there for a while. He thought about the demand, the 23 species it had shaped into protectorates, stable, quiet, provided for, no longer themselves. He thought about the 24 species that had stood in a chamber with 47 delegates, and sent one old man with a book and a very old data core. He thought about what it meant that the old man had brought a book. Not strategy documents, not a communication device for last-minute instructions from the imperial government. A book, something to read while he waited. The choice of a person who had been patient for a long time, and had learned to make the waiting comfortable. He thought about what kind of history produced that. His color, cold blue for 40 years, the blue of certainty, the blue of a man who knew how rooms would go, had not returned. Whatever it was shifting toward, it had not settled into anything he had a name for yet. He was not sure it would. He walked back to the main chamber. The institution was already moving. The formal classification paperwork, the communication drafts to Terran diplomatic channels, the internal review of what a sovereign peer relationship required and who would lead it. 47 species and their thousands of staff, organized into motion. He found his seat. He opened his files. He did not read the military index. He opened the Terran Historical Archive and went back to the beginning. The flood, 9,000 years ago. 3 civilizations destroyed in weeks. Millions dead. He read what they built after. He did not skip ahead.